Hi, good afternoon, and thank you again for joining us. We're happy to have this esteemed panel joining us for today's briefing, but I would like to begin by thanking Chairman Tom Cole's office for helping us secure the room for today's program. And if you haven't done so already, I encourage you to grab lunch in the back of the room and let us know if there's anything more we can do. And we also have handouts on migraine, more information, statistics, and details for you right outside the room at the registration table. Again, today's program is focused on the value of research and prevention in addressing the societal burden of migraine. I'm Suzanne Folks, the Vice President of Communications at Research America. We're a nonprofit advocacy alliance dedicated to making research to improve health a much higher national priority. And our membership spans the entire research ecosystem, from academia, patient groups, independent research institutes, scientific societies, foundations, and industry. So on our panel today, we're so happy to have Dr. Walter Koroshetz, Director of the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, Dr. Brian Gifford, Director, Research and Measurement at the Integrated Benefits Institute, Jaime Sanders, the Migraine Diva, who's our migraine patient advocate today. She has a terrific blog, and I encourage you to follow her blog, and Dr. Amaal Starling, Assistant Professor of Neurology at the Mayo Clinic. Mary Franklin, the Executive Director of the National Headache Foundation, will moderate today's panel. And more information about their background and bios can be found in today's program. We're also encouraging you to join the conversation on social media using the hashtag RAMigraine in your tweets and Facebook posts. And we're also videotaping today's program, and we'll have the video available shortly after on our website, researchamerica.org. So our panelists today will talk about migraine, which is a major public health issue with serious social and economic consequences. And in spite of its impact on individuals, families, and the economy, research into the causes and treatment and prevention of migraine is severely underfunded. So our panelists will explore that issue and other related issues to migraine in today's discussion, and we look forward to hearing their insights. So on that note, I'd like to turn the podium over to Mary Franklin, who will begin today's program.
I want to thank Research America for hosting this panel. It's a great opportunity to explore migraine, and we would like each speaker then to give about 2-3 minutes opening statements, starting with Dr. Koroshetz. So.
Great. Well, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here and talk to you today a little bit about research, and I must have to give our thanks to Research America for supporting research throughout this country. It's what made our country great and makes us the leader in biomedical research. And yet there, as you'll hear, although we've made progress, there's tremendous amount that we still have left to do. And so our institute, the Neurological Institute, is interested in trying to get young people interested in the science of migraine to try to see what new things they can come up with that can help the patients who suffer with migraine. And so just when you thought, the summer's out and you didn't have to go to school anymore, I'm going to give you a little anatomy lecture, and there'll be a little test afterwards. But this is just an example to illustrate what's really happening in migraine. So it's a headache. You think it's a pain coming from your brain. In fact, the brain does not have any pain receptors. So the pain is coming, you think it's in your head, but the pain has to be coming from receptors that travel in to a central area inside the base of the brain, which is seen here. Now those receptors are getting information from your face, from the surface of your head, and actually from inside the skull. The covering that covers the brain has pain fibers. And those pain fibers also innervate the blood vessels on the covering of the brain. So what happens in migraine is that you feel like you have a headache, and the question is, where are those signals coming from that are starting off this headache? And that's really been what people have been trying to delve into for years and years. Well, we've learned a lot about the anatomy and the circuitry. We have still more to learn. But we also learned a lot about how those different cells in the circuit communicate with each other they use what's called neurotransmitters, which are chemicals that leave one nerve cell and go and stimulate another nerve cell. And the treatments for migraine that are now very effective for treating attacks, so called the triptan medications, they block one of the action of one of these neurotransmitters that's released when you have migraine. We still don't have a really good sense of what causes the migraine and where it starts in the brain. There's lots of different hypotheses, but we haven't really nailed that down yet. But even with that incomplete knowledge, drug companies have been able to make a lot of really good medications that, over the last 20, 25 years have come into very constant use. This is an interesting example about light. So when you have a migraine, how many people in the audience have migraine? Yeah, about a third. That's about right. So when you have a migraine, as everybody knows, light really bothers you. It causes pain. It's very annoying. So it turns out the light goes into your retina, and when I was training, no one knew there was any connection between the retina, which sees the light, and the pain. So it was really a mystery. What people have found out is that there actually are connections now between certain cells in the retina. They don't go through the usual visual pathways, but they go right to the pain center inside the brain called the thalamus. And so it's an interesting fact. Turns out it can be potentially useful. So if you want to study and do research on migraine, what you'd really like to have is an animal model of migraine. And Michael Ochinsky back here, who's our program director for migraine, worked on trying to develop models for migraine. One of the good ones is this photophobia model, so that you can actually stimulate the animal what you think causes migraine, but he can't tell you if he has a headache or not, but he will stay away from the light if he has a headache. So you can actually use the light to see how the animals avoid the light as a measure of whether they have a headache, and then you can treat them with chemicals that you think might prevent the headache, and that's actually what happens. So this CGRP protein has been thought to be involved in migraine, and by giving antibodies to this animal, you can see that the animal does not have the migraine that he would otherwise have if he gets these antibodies. These antibodies are now going to the FDA for approval to treat migraine. So just an example of how the research on something which, if you read the first abstract, why does light bother people with migraine? You wouldn't think, well, why would you invest in that? But this is a nice example of why investing in that gets you to a treatment. And that's what's, I think, going to happen in the next couple of months. There's going to be a whole new class of very effective treatments for migraine. The other thing is, it turns out when you study the light effect, it's not all different colors of light that cause you to feel pain when you have a migraine. In actual fact, green light will actually make you feel better. So some people in Boston are using green light as a therapy to kind of calm down the pain when people have migraine. So here you see the pain at different levels of light, and the green is the one that actually decreases the pain. So as Mary mentioned, the amount of research done for migraine pales in comparison to its burden of illness. So many people have migraine. It's a leading cause of trouble in the workforce, and you'll hear about that. This is the NIH funding is about $18 million a year, so that's a really good investment, but it's way below what the problem really needs. I just wanted to end up by saying that NIH is really interested in moving the pain field forward, not just in migraine, but other areas of pain. So we run a pain consortium, so multiple institutes at NIH come together to work on pain. We have a coordinating committee that takes input from the public and from different agencies. We developed the National Pain Strategy, which has been released as a guiding light on how to treat pain in this country. And lastly, to say that the NIH is responding to the need to develop scientific answers to the opioid crisis, and there are 3 meetings going on this month to get industry partners and NIH people working together to get therapies for pain that are not addictive that will get us out of the opioid crisis. So with that, I want to end, and I want to thank everybody and look forward to the panel. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jaime Sanders, and I am a person living with migraine. And I am a blogger as well. My blog is the Migraine Diva, and I'm also a migraine patient advocate. I'd like to thank Research America for hosting this event and for allowing someone like me to show the patient perspective, which isn't always given that opportunity. I have lived with migraine my entire life. My first migraine diagnosis was when I was 8 years old, although I had undiagnosed abdominal migraine from the age of 1. I remained episodic throughout most of my youth and my 20s, but around the age of 25, I started to have more frequent and harder to treat migraines. And at 27, I was diagnosed with chronic migraine, and a few years later, at 30, with new daily persistent headache and chronic daily headache. Despite living a life of chronic pain, I have always managed to find the strength and will to move forward in life. Having a debilitating illness, which carries the stigma, is no easy life to live. Wanting to remove that stigma, educate society, and provide support to other people with migraine prompted me to start my blog, The Migraine Diva. Through my own challenges, failed treatments, and successes, I can champion for myself and for the millions of others who live and fight silently with this chronic neurological disorder. Patient advocacy is one of my passions. Using my voice and journey as a catalyst to keep the conversation going will continue to be my driving force to put migraine and other headache disorders on the forefront, to gain better access to treatment, research, and support. As a mother, wife, daughter, sister, and friend, it is extremely important that I do not let my illness diminish my worth, importance, role in life, or capabilities. Although migraine puts limits on my life, I am still a whole person who deserves to be seen as such. Migraine is as diverse a disorder as are the people who occupy this planet. Not one migraine patient is the same as the other. Although we may experience migraine differently, we all strive for the same thing, inclusion. We want and need more research, more funding, better access to specialists, and advocates within the medical field and pharmacology companies. We do not want to be seen simply as people with an illness, but as people who deserve and have a right to all of those things without having to prove that our pain is legitimate over and over again. I hope that this briefing enlightens you to the needs of migraine patients and encourages you to help us reach those goals. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Brian Gifford. I'm with the Integrative Benefits Institute. It's a nonprofit association that's focused on workforce health and productivity. Mostly we talk to employers, and I'm happy to follow Jaime because it really underscores the importance of telling stories. Employers will get lots of numbers, big scare numbers. The last one I saw for migraine was that it's $20 billion to employers in terms of their healthcare spend and in terms of lost productivity, people who are feeling too unwell to show up to work, or when they work, they can't work really as well as they expect of themselves and as their employers expect of them as well. But employers don't really care about those scare numbers as much as they care about being able to control them. So what an employer really wants to know, since they are the payer of healthcare benefits for a lot of people, they really want to know, is there an effective treatment? Is there going to be any kind of value in helping people feel better? And these are businesses. Excuse me if this sounds coarse, but what they really want are people who are well enough to show up and do the work for them, to produce their products, to provide their services, and to help make them successful businesses. Now, there's not a lot of good evidence out there for the reasons that Dr. Koroshetz talked about that let us say that a person who has treatment A versus treatment B or no treatment actually is a better employee than another employee. So what do? We go back onto survey research. So what our group did was we used a survey that was designed by the Harvard Medical School for the World Health Organization. We looked at 32,000 people from 8 different employers, maybe 9 different employers. We split them into 3 groups based on their based on their history with chronic severe headaches. And what we have found, and this is how we tell the story to employers, is first of all, let's look at people with no headaches. Over the course of a month, they're going to miss almost half a day of work. When you look at people with migraines, they're missing almost a full day. So you have twice as much absence for people with migraines compared to people with no migraines. Same with chronic severe or frequent and severe headaches. This is the story that they usually get. People with migraines are not at work as often as other people. But what we also did is we took into account how often people have headaches. And what we found was that almost all the difference is going to be explained by the frequency of headaches over the course of a month. Put very simply, when people who experience migraines or when they have historically experienced migraines, when they go through those periods where they feel really well, they're as good an employee as anybody else. They can show up to work just as often as anybody else. We push this out to how well they work on the job in terms of can they concentrate at work? Can they work carefully? Can they do good quality work? And what we found is the percentage of people who were really feeling that their own work was suffering because of migraines or for any reason at all, we find that that difference goes away when you just adjust for their headaches. Okay? So this is, to me, in the absence of randomized controlled trials, this kind of case control or comparison study, it really shows that there is a lot of lost opportunities on the table out there, and employers really are not seeing this issue the way we think they should be, which is if they are able to help people manage their conditions better, reduce the frequency of headaches, reduce the severity of headaches, they really can have a business advantage. Okay, this is a bottom line kind of issue, getting people to work as often as they need to be, having them work as good as they can, and we're really not seeing it. What do employers care about instead? Again, we go back to the big ticket issues. They care about really expensive kinds of treatments such as cancer. They care about things that are expensive and very common, such as back problems. They care about disability leaves. They care about things they write checks for, and they don't write checks for, or they don't see themselves writing checks for people who are potentially working under their level because they're struggling with migraine. Some of this may change, and this will be the cliffhanger. Some of this may change as some of the specialty drugs that are in the development pipeline. Monoclonal antibodies are one. They've been shown to be rather effective in some trials so far. They're not through the phase 3 trials yet, but they may have a high price tag. And the question for employers is going to be, are you going to focus on the large price tag of the drugs, or are you going to focus on the potential advantage to your day in and day out businesses, the things that really actually make you a business? And I leave that as the cliffhanger. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. So as stated before, my name is Dr. Amaal Starling, and I'll also stand over to the side so everyone can see me. And I am a neurologist and a migraine specialist from Mayo Clinic in Phoenix, Arizona. And it really is my pleasure and my honor to be able to speak to all of you today regarding the gaps in migraine care, especially to a group of people that can potentially change this. So the gaps in migraine care was actually very well defined in this population-based study that was performed specifically in chronic migraine. So chronic migraine is defined as a debilitating neurologic disease that results in the individual having at least 15 days per month of debilitating symptoms, at least 15 days per month. Many times people will have more. However, in this debilitating neurologic disease, we found in the study that 40% of individuals actually don't even go to a doctor. And then out of that, 10% of individuals, once they get to a doctor, may get a correct diagnosis. And then 4.5% of individuals talked to a doctor, got the right diagnosis, and got the standard of care treatment. 4.5%. And the story gets worse, if you can imagine that. Other studies have demonstrated that 50% of those individuals have discontinued their treatment within 30 days of starting it because it doesn't work and it causes tons and tons of side effects. So approximately 2% of these patients that are debilitated by chronic migraine might be getting some sort of effective treatment. That should be staggering. It should be absolutely staggering when you consider that migraine is such a debilitating disease that affects 40 million Americans in the US. We must do better than that, especially given that migraine and headache diseases actually causes so much neurologic burden. In this graph, all of the green is attributed to the neurologic burden of disease in people with migraine and other headache diseases. And the NIH has actually published a graph that demonstrates on the x-axis disease burden, on the y-axis is NIH funding on a logarithmic scale. This is funding based on disease burden. And as you can see, the dots that are highlighted are grossly out of the norm of the other disease that are funded. If migraine was funded based on disease burden, as is recommended, then migraine would be funded $100 million or more per month, $100 million per year. However, instead, it's actually funded about $20-ish million per year. That is a huge gap in such a debilitating disease. And so this lack in funding is what leads to the gap in care, because it leads to stigma. So think about it. From a top-down approach, if the National Institute of Health is funding a disease about $20 million a year, then people might think, you know what? The medical world and patients at large might think, migraine is not really a serious, debilitating disease that deserves appropriate funding from the NIH. Maybe it's just a headache. Now, if you take one thing from this session, this is it. Migraine is not just a headache. Migraine is a neurologic disease that deserves funding based on disease burden. If we don't fund it based on disease burden, we will then have a lack of new investigators coming into the field. We'll have a lack of these new clinician scientists that are brilliant to develop more migraine research. With a lack of migraine research, we will have a lack of novel treatments. And this will lead to the gaps in care, and they will not improve. This leads to reduced patient access because we don't have enough headache clinicians. Remember I said there's 40 million people in the US with migraine? We have 520 headache specialists in the US. Those gaps are stark and amazing. And this is also leading to the lack of any safe and effective treatment options. So how do we fill these gaps in migraine care? Number one, we're all focused on the opioid crisis, but I actually don't even like the name, the opioid crisis. This is not the opioid crisis. This is the chronic pain and chronic migraine crisis. That's where our focus needs to lie. Research in chronic migraine and chronic pain. Directed funds for migraine research. Directed funds for development and training grants to incentivize new investigators coming into this field and developing novel therapeutic targets and drugs so that we can then eventually treat migraine effectively and reduce burden. We're not going to be able to do that based on the current funding. In fact, it's estimated that with the new funding cuts, that migraine is going from a 25 million to a 20 million cut. Whereas if we're doing this based on disease burden, migraine should not have been cut. So I hope that my urgency to my plea is obvious and well heard. I hope that the answer is clear, that we need directed funds specifically for research in migraine. We need directed funds specifically for training grants and development grants so that we can incentivize new investigators to come into the migraine field, develop novel targets, and develop novel therapeutics. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists. They all had excellent remarks regarding migraine, the gaps in research, and its impact on society. I didn't thank all of you for coming today. Usually when I give a migraine talk, I say to the audience, either you have migraine or someone you love has migraine. I know lunch was part of your impetus to come here today, but maybe you had wanted lunch because you didn't want to get a headache later. The timing of this session is very important because June is National Migraine and Headache Awareness Month, so this is a great time for us to be here and speaking about it. The National Headache Foundation, who I represent, we have done for several years. Purple is the color for migraine awareness. So we ask people, put on your purple, show support. There are other initiatives this month that I'd like to speak about. One is American Migraine Foundation. Their Move Against Migraine, and you can check out their website. There's also Shades for Migraine, which is happening on June 21st. That's sponsored by the Alliance for Headache Disorders. This kind of goes in line with Dr. Koroshetz with the light and migraine. They are asking folks, wear shades all day, wear your sunglasses all day, and take photos of places you wouldn't normally wear sunglasses, and post it to the Alliance for Headache Disorders website, or you can go Shades for Migraine. I think it has its own website. I also want to talk, since we're in a Washington group, that Miles for Migraine, which is another advocacy group, is having a race on October 15th here in D.C. It's an excellent program. The funds that they go to research and also sponsoring fellowships in headache. I can't underscore Dr. Starling's comment. There are 40 million Americans with migraine, and there are 500 and some doctors that have subspecialty in headache. So we need to get that word out and encourage the new physicians to go into headache medicine. And with that, I will open up here we go again. Open up the discussion with Dr. Koroshetz and a couple questions. You were very good telling us what's going around in the federal level to advance research in migraine. Can you discuss disparities that you see in that research with certain populations, women, veterans, and other underserved populations?
Right. So as Jaime said, migraine patients are all different, and there are some clear differences when you look at populations. I just start off with the veterans, for instance. So there's a recent study of servicemen and women who have been exposed to blast injury in Iraq and Afghanistan. Follow-up study 5 years later. Unfortunately, they're not doing any better. In many instances, they're doing worse functionally, and headache is the top of the list of things that are causing trouble. So I'd say that is a unique problem that we knew a little bit about. People with head injury oftentimes suffered with headache for a long time after their head injury, but an area that, again, has very little research going on. I think there are certainly racial disparities in headache. So African-American women are about 27% more frequent headaches than Caucasian women. African-American women are more likely to have severe headaches than Caucasian Americans. And so I think, there are clear genetic causes for the differences of headache. Migraine is frequently inherited in families. It's been a big push to try and find out what the genes are, but no one's really quite cracked that yet. But I think that's a really interesting area of research to try and get to the genetic basis, probably multiple genes, and they're segregated in different populations, which account for a lot of the disparities.
Thank you. Also, could you tell us about how you feel migraine impacts disability-adjusted life years? Has there been on the NIH level?
So I think Amaal showed that so there are these measures they call DALYs, disability-adjusted life years, that people use to, rate diseases versus another. They're not very precise, but it's the best thing we have. But headache is a major cause of disability. I think it's now number 6 in the entire world, and it's number 3 in the U.S. for people under the age of 50. So the other thing that, I think Jaime indicated it, that migraine occurs in children, occurs in young adults. That's really where the big burden of illness is. And And to Brian's point, that's where, productivity in the workplace comes in. And so it is clearly a huge problem. And I think Anil made that clear.
Thank you. Jaime, thank you so much for the courage to tell your story. We think of migraine as a spectrum that affects people at different ways at different points in their life. Can you address that a little about how it's affected you at different times of your life and how it would relate to societal impact of migraine?
Absolutely. As I stated in my opening remarks, I was diagnosed at 8 years old. That was my formal diagnosis with migraine. But before that, before anybody really had any idea of what it was, since a toddler, I experienced abdominal migraine. So I had all the symptoms of migraine without the head pain. I didn't experience the head pain until I reached about the 3rd grade. And growing up in the early 80s, mid 80s with migraine was really difficult because the stigma then was a lot bigger than it is now. So I had to deal with teachers who didn't understand, classmates who felt like I was faking it because I didn't want to be in school. And that was very difficult because as a child, you're not taught that language and how to support yourself in situations like that. You're not supposed to really advocate for yourself at that age. Nobody gives you the guidelines for that. That was difficult. Luckily for me, because migraine runs in my family, my parents and my sisters and my immediate family, my cousins, my grandparents, they were all supportive. So I've always had a strong support base. But stepping outside of my family, society did not accept my pain as legitimate. So as a child, I had to learn to kind of deal with it on my own and push through my pain because nobody was going to be there to help me through it. And that is something I think children still are doing today. And I could understand how difficult it is as a child for someone to really understand that what you're experiencing is truly debilitating, because as an adult, I'm still dealing with that stigma and having to push against that. And it's very difficult to advocate for yourself when you're in pain, especially with chronic migraine. You're in pain almost every day, and it's really difficult to function normally through life and attend to your responsibilities when you're constantly dealing with cognitive issues, fatigue, constant triggers going off, avoiding them, sleep deprivation. It's so hard, and so many people don't realize how difficult it really is. So it's really important that we address not only migraine as an adult issue, we really need to focus on adolescents and children, because speaking as that 8-year-old kid, I wish I had more people in my corner and helped me get through those difficult attacks that I had to deal with on my own most of the time. And nobody, especially children, should have to go through that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do you think it's difficult for patients to be able to release their health data so that they can advance research? Do you think that also with the stigma playing part of that?
I think that's twofold. I think you're going to have a group of patients who have had such a horrible experience dealing with their diagnosis and treatment and care that they are not going to be willing to provide that information. But for patients like myself who have had such a long history with it, and despite it, still are managing to push forward and move forward and find better things that will work for them, are going to be more willing to share that information, because it's going to allow for better research, better funding for research. It's going to allow researchers to develop more treatment options that may be, more focused on the individuality of migraine if more people contributed their health data, because not one migraine patient's experience is the same as the other. Not everybody responds to the same treatments. Some people are allergic to a boatload of medications that are traditionally prescribed, so their pathway to healing is going to be different. So I think that it will probably be a split in who will want to participate in that, but as myself, that's something I would advocate for, because that's only going to better my prognosis later on. If not for myself, then for people like my nephew, who's 13 and is having daily migraines right now. And I hate to see him suffering, because I was that kid. So I would definitely advocate for that. I think it would be a huge asset to the migraine community and its future.
Great, thanks, Jamie. Brian, you talked about what employers look at or should look at. What can employer groups do to help accommodate migraine?
Accommodation is one of the only ways I think that employers are really dealing with the migraine issue. And by accommodation, I mean it really happens on a person-to-person level, where a person with a migraine is working it out with their supervisors that when I have some kind of episode, I need to either work from home if they can, if they have that kind of job. I need to have a quiet, dark place that I can go for a couple of hours until I can until the migraine recedes. But you start to see the downsides of that kind of haphazard approach to managing migraines. One is it opens the door for particularism. If your relationship with your supervisor is not good, you're probably not going to be as accommodated as well. And it's very uncoordinated. So there's really no best practices for how to help manage people on the job with migraines. And again, every time somebody gets to that point where they can't come to work, that's a loss. That's a business loss. It's not abstract any longer. It's an even bigger loss when you think about people who are no longer able to participate fully in the labor force. That's a loss to businesses. The issue, though, is the business groups themselves, they're trained to focus on costs and where they see the costs or where they see the stories. So there are plenty of disease management programs that employers put in place. Diabetes, high cholesterol. And the reason they do this is because they understand that prevention today is going to help them avoid very costly emergency room claims down the road. They don't necessarily see that with migraine. So what they see is a lot of pressure to prevent really costly acute events down the road, and they miss all of the losses to their business on a day in and day out basis. So I go back to this issue of how do they understand the story of migraine in the workplace? This is the only way that employers themselves are going to start to collectively understand what they have at stake and what they've been losing for quite a long time.
It would probably behoove research groups to focus on that and get the word out, raise the education and awareness level of the employer.
Well, right, and again, you have to tell the story in a way that is going to resonate with an employer. On a person-to-person basis, you can tell stories about the quality of life. Jamie can tell her story. People will understand that. When you get to the level of that person who decides, what are our benefits going to be? What are we going to actually pay for? Are we going to have certain kinds of treatments on this higher tier? If any of you know what a formulary is, formularies are lists of drugs that are covered by an insurance plan. Is it going to be on the high tier plan where people have to pay more out of their own pocket? Or is it going to be on the lower tier plan? If you put things on a tier where people have to pay a lot more money out of their own pocket, they're likely to skip medications if they can't afford it. And so all of the good work that you would do to underscore the productivity implications of migraine, to underscore the benefits of helping people be healthy and helping people manage their condition, it's going to go away if people can't follow the regimen. So this is where I think the research community really can help themselves by putting it in those kinds of terms. We have effective treatments. There aren't enough people, as Amal pointed out, there aren't enough people who are getting the good treatment that they need, and this is a loss. This is a business loss.
Thank you. Dr. Starling, you mentioned all the gaps that we have to face in migraine and headache medicine. What would you say are great progress factors that we've made in the last few years?
So there has been, and thanks to NIH funding, a lot of basic science research that has been done to understand migraine pathophysiology, or what's happening in the brain. And because of this, since 1962, we have not had a preventive treatment option that is truly designed for the treatment of migraine. So currently, the FDA-approved treatment options are borrowed drugs from other fields. So sometimes people will use antidepressant medications because they found that that can help in migraine patients. Sometimes they'll use these medications called beta blockers or blood pressure medications because they found that that helps in people with migraine. Or anti-seizure medications, again, because they found that it helps in people with migraine. But those medications, since they were not designed for the treatment of migraine, they are not very effective. And those medications, because they were not designed for the treatment of migraine, have tons of side effects, what we call off-target toxicity. But since we, in the last couple years, have had this burgeoning of migraine pathophysiology basic science lab research funded by the NIH, we've discovered this pathway, the CGRP pathway. You'll hear a lot about it. It stands for calcitonin gene-related peptide pathway. And this pathway is something that's involved in the pathogenesis of migraine. And because of that, we were able to develop treatment options specifically for that pathway. Some of them were specific molecules to block those receptors. Some of those were actually antibodies that were developed to sequester those pathways and to shut them down as much as possible. And thus far, we've had several phase 2 and even completion of a couple phase 3 clinical trials. And every single trial has been effective, and not only effective, but with very, very minimal side effects. So this is the benefit of having that research. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that our research is done and we've cracked the case of migraine, because we found with those drugs is that it helps for a certain group of people with migraine. So about 30% of people in all these different studies with all the different drugs, about 30% of people have an amazing response. We can't forget about the other percentage of people. We still need to do more basic science research to figure out what's going on in those individuals. It might be a different drug treatment. Again, back to what everyone else has said, is that we want to get to the holy grail of individualized treatment. Can I tell you a quick story, actually? So my mom, who is doing really, really well now, but she was diagnosed with breast cancer about 4 years ago now. And I remember going with her to her oncology appointment. And her oncologist sat her down and said, okay, and my poor mom, she had 2 different breast cancers on 2 different sides. So they said, okay, for your right side, these are what the pathology has shown, and we're going to give you this treatment because we know it works for that cancer. And then on your left side, we're going to give you these drugs because we know that that works for this cancer. We've tried it in the dish, and we know that it kills those cancer cells. Individualized treatment. And although I was super, super happy and excited and thankful for my mom, I was jealous that I could not provide that type of treatment for my migraine patients. I want to be able to have my migraine patients come in. I want to be able to take their blood and say, oh, guess what? This drug's going to work for you. This one's going to give you side effects, and this one's definitely not going to work. That's the holy grail, and I think we can get there if we increase migraine-directed funding and increase those development grants for new investigators.
Thank you. With that, we also have to approach the comorbidities of migraine. Mm-hmm. And this definitely impacts disability as well as the research into treatments. Could you address some of that with comorbidities?
Definitely, definitely. So there are a lot of comorbidities with migraine, and we're actually learning that there are more and more. So what has always been known is that there are some psychiatric comorbidities, depression, anxiety. There are some comorbidities with obesity. There are comorbidities with other medical conditions, and more recently, we have actually found that there's actually a higher risk for cardiovascular disease, so myocardial infarction or heart attacks and stroke. And so people used to think, oh, well, migraine is just a headache, it's not going to kill you, but actually, we're starting to learn that if it's traveling with these other diseases, having that migraine brain and migraine pathophysiology may actually be leading to deaths that we were missing previously. And so making sure that we address all those different comorbidities by having more basic science research, we'll be able to understand how they correlate. There was actually an interesting study that was just published, I think it was just an online publication yesterday, talking about what are the poor prognostic factors in the treatment of migraine. And those things include mood disorders, as well as poor self-efficacy, as well as a couple other modifiable factors. And that's what I really liked about it. There are things that we can change. And so there also needs to be research that's done looking at the modification of those different comorbidities so that we can effectively treat migraine and its comorbidities. And eventually, all of that will then reduce the burden that we have from migraine.
Dr. Koroshetz, now you've heard all of our encouraging of what kind of research. Do you think we can go forward from here with funding?
Yeah. So I think that the field is certainly growing, but it's going way too slow. So the things to know about the NIH budget is that it's actually driven primarily bottom up. So our system, as compared to other countries, is the scientists submit grants, they get reviewed, and the best science gets funded until you run out of money, and that's usually somewhere around the 12th percentile now, so 88% of the grants don't get funded. And in the area of headache, we've had a lot of trouble getting people interested in studying it. So when I was with the Academy of Neurology, we would have headache fellowships for physicians to study headache research, and no one would apply. So there is a real problem with people with trying to get the scientists interested. Now, what happens in a field of science is if it's murky and it's not clear what the foothold is that you can move your science forward, people stay away from it. I think the advantage of migraine now is that there's a beachhead of science, like as was mentioned, certainly CGRP, the triptans, the pain system, that I think we can attract more people in. So although migraine only receives about $25 million a year, pain itself, which is really integrated, migraine's a different form of pain. There are hundreds of different types of pain. But the pain research budget in NIH is about $430 million. What we hope is that people studying pain in the abdomen may actually help understand why children, when they have their migraine, have abdominal pain. And very real mystery. So I think the caveat is that I think the science of pain is moving forward. This should actually help us with getting more research done on migraine. And migraine itself, I think we have a better understanding of what's going on, and that attracts people in. We have something called the Brain Initiative. I told you about the circuit of migraine pain. The Brain Initiative is developing technologies where people can manipulate the circuit precisely. So we can go in now in the brain of a mouse to the particular nerve cells we want to turn on or turn off, and those technologies are just coming in, but they're going to be powerful in the pain circuit field because they're going to now give people a tool to be able to study this in the brain. So I think I'm very optimistic. I think the research funding across the board is real important. Getting more people into migraine research is a challenge that we're working on it. We agree that we need more people in the area.
So my plea is that we take more of a top-down approach so that we incentivize young investigators that are brilliant with all these great ideas to come into the field of migraine with the development of more training grants and development grants such as K Awards that are specifically targeted towards migraine so that people will be incentivized to come into the field. And then to increase the funding for migraine specifically, so directed funding that is substantial, that is in line with the burden of the disease, as well as something that's sustained over the course of at least 10 years. And I promise you that will be transformative for the field and will advance care. So that is our plea, is a more top-down approach to increase the number of people in migraine research.
Jamie, we're going to have a question and answer section in a minute. Jamie, what do you think needs to be out on your blog to get people attracted to migraine or to become their own advocates?
Most
Not just your
definitely.
blog.
Just in general, I think what I see from people who respond to my blog, who follow, who also are people living with migraine or chronic migraine or even other headache disorders, is that they're just looking for new drugs, new treatments, effective ways, different ways to manage their migraine. They're also very, they also want to know what changes are, being applied to any drug policies. That affects a lot of people with migraine. The opioid issue. Some people with migraine are on opiates, but they're not addicted to them. And unfortunately, because of that, a lot of times their medication is significantly decreased, which is then causing them more debilitation in the end. And they have these frustrations but don't have anywhere to really go and discuss that and say how that affects them. That is a huge topic that I see a lot on my news feeds. Accessibility to healthcare. The biggest thing is not everybody has access to a headache or migraine specialist. And because of that, there is a lack of effective treatment for them. A lot of people are seeing just their primary care physicians. Some may be seeing pain management specialists, but again, it's very limited in the knowledge and the availability of treatment specific to migraine for that person. So we need to have more accessibility to specialists for headache disorders in general. And then advocating ways for them to advocate for themselves. It's difficult, but it's something that a migraine patient has to learn to do. You have to advocate for yourself at your doctor's appointments, in urgent care, in the emergency room. And if you're like me and have to wind up being, put into the hospital for 4 or 5 days for a DHE infusion because you had a migraine for 3 weeks that won't go away, you have to advocate for yourself in that setting also. And it's really, really difficult to do. But once patients realize that they are the head of their medical team and they know exactly what path they want their healing to go down, and that the people that work for them, their doctors, their nurses, their specialists, they have to utilize those people to their best advantage and speak up for themselves to say, this works for me, this doesn't work for me. I've heard about this, can we talk about how this might help, how it may not help? It's very important for migraine patients to use their voice. And since this is a disease that has a huge stigma, we're taught to be silent with it. But I encourage everybody to speak up, use your voice in every aspect of your disease and of your life. Although there are limits to it, you can have a better quality of life and still find, some happiness in your life despite what you're going through. So advocating is a huge thing that I push on my blog. Things like Headache on the Hill, where people can come and lobby their Congress people and talk about how migraine affects them and what it is that they need and what they see the needs and wants are of the migraine community that will benefit them. That's huge. Sharing information with your medical team and their staff, things that you may come across if you attend, say like the AMA patient conference, the American Headache and Migraine Association patient conference, which was just last weekend in Boston. If you attend that and you gain this wealth of knowledge, bring that back to your medical staff and your medical team and say, this is what I learned. And I think this is important for you to know what I know. So sharing information is important. And we need to increase our visibility as migraine patients. So having patients and caregivers join AMA is a huge push that I like to do as well.
All right, I'm going to open it up for questions. Yes.
Hi, sir. Last December, Congress spent a lot of time and effort passing the 21st Century Cures Act, which is a stab at kind of a top-down approach, but I think I know the answer to this, but I'm curious. Can you walk me through how passage of that bill helped funding at NINDS
Right, so the omnibus gave us an increase to NIH, and everybody's grateful for that, and that goes through most of the NIH space. The 21st Century Cures bill had targeted areas, and the one that's most relevant to pain is what I mentioned, is the Brain Initiative. So the Brain Initiative is authorized in that bill for $1.5 billion over the next 10 years, and that enables us to develop the tools for understanding circuit function and dysfunction, which I think is going to really transform how we understand migraine.
Any other questions?
Dr. Starling, in your remarks, you talked about the 10% rate of misdiagnosis of patients with migraines. Do you think that's more a symptom of not having enough specialists who are real familiar with migraine, or is that something that results from diagnostic tools and tests not being where they need to be?
Yeah.
Kind of inconclusive.
Definitely. And so just to clarify, and I think this is what you meant to say, but remember 90% of people were not being appropriately diagnosed, and 10% were the ones that went to a doctor and received an accurate diagnosis. It's a product of stigma. So I had a friend of mine who apparently has been suffering from migraine for about 2 years. But what she has received from her doctors is an hour-long session talking to her about how she's really stressed out, and that's why she's getting headaches, right? And so it's the stigma of migraine, and there is an external stigma of migraine that then develops this internal stigma of migraine that then causes 60% of patients to not even go to the doctor to talk about their migraine, because someone's going to have an hour-long conversation about how, you're a working mom and that's really stressful and that's why you're getting some headaches. Migraine is not a product of stress. Migraine is a neurologic disease.
Can I follow up on that as well?
Sure. Go ahead.
You can see that in the statistics that I showed you when I split the group into migraineurs and people with frequent and severe headaches. I suspect those are the same people, because when you look into the data, they have the exact same frequency of headaches. So these are people who are self-diagnosing. So if you're not able to explain what's going on to somebody who may not be an expert in the field, this is where you're going to end up without any recourse or without any avenues to really good treatment.
And to extend on that, those are also individuals, I know we're going back and forth. To extend on that, those individuals that are self-diagnosing are also then self-treating with over-the-counter medications that actually makes the whole pathophysiology worse, and also could eventually lead into using medications such as opioid medications, whether they be legal or even illegal, leading to really what we call the chronic migraine crisis, the chronic pain crisis that everyone else is calling the opioid crisis.
One more.
Yeah, Dr. Starling, you put the graph with disease disability on the x-axis and funny on the y-axis. Can you go into more depth about how they determine disease disability, how they define that?
Yeah, I'll actually let Dr. Koroshetz do that, because that's actually data from the NIH, so that's on the NIH website.
Right, so it's a graph of prevalence of disease and the amount of funding that goes to diseases. And actually, the worst is headache. That's the biggest disparity between the prevalence and the amount of money that goes in. Prevalence, yeah, in the population. Because migraine, as you saw, 30% of the people in the room have migraine, so it's incredibly prevalent.
It's a measure of burden,
Right.
right? So the burden of disease, there's a huge disparity between the burden of disease and the amount of funding. And if you go along that line, it should be funded at least $100 million per year, whereas it's only funded about $20-ish million per year.
So when you say burden, you just mean burden in terms of how many people are affected by it?
Yeah, it's disability times the number of people, right? So it's incredibly prevalent, so that drives it really high.
So the x-axis stands for disability-adjusted life years. And so it's a combination of prevalence and disability.
One more.
Brian, you indicated that employers oftentimes look at the bottom line, so the cost associated with migraine. In your field, have you experienced any successes in educating employers on the impact of developing programs, employer-focused programs that will
I have not seen significant efforts in that area, even though there are precedents for them. So again, there are very good high-quality diabetes management programs that happen on the worksite. I don't necessarily see them for migraine. We would try to take evidence such as that we brought, and frankly, we'll change the subject about healthcare spending, and we will always try to tell employers those are only some costs. The other costs are absences. The other costs are in low performance. But it's a really difficult issue. They want a strong evidence base. And I think even getting the step to where you can say, here's an effective treatment where we can minimize the number of headaches that people are having, or the number of migraines that they're having, or they are reducing the severity. I don't think you need to take that next step with employers in every case. I think they can make it on their own because they've all been everybody who's in that position to purchase has been a supervisor in the past. Everybody has dealt with this issue in the workplace. Everybody has had a coworker or a subordinate employee who's been debilitated by headaches. So it's really developing that early evidence base that shows this is a manageable condition. This is not a complete loss all the time.
It's time to wrap up. I want to thank everyone, especially our distinguished panel. Thank Research America for hosting it, and thank you all for coming. I hope you learned a lot today.
That's fun.